Hello, and welcome to Down the Dark Stairwell Post Film Conversation. This conversation is a special program of Sis Streams and Andersfield Wolf Book Awards as part of the 2021 Cleveland Book Week presented by the Cleveland Foundation. My name is Eric Seiler, and I'm a professor of film, media arts, and communications at Cleveland State University, as well as moderator for this conversation. We are very pleased to be joined by the director of Down the Dark Stairwell, Ursula Lane. Ursula has worked as a journalist in big outlets such as the New York Times and ESPN, the magazine. She currently freelances as a film and television producer and story consultant. She grew up in Newton, Massachusetts, but now lives in the Bronx, New York. Her debut film, Nine Man, which is about a street ball battle in the heart of Chinatown, was broadcast on PBS. Our most recent project, Down the Dark Stairwell, was also broadcast on PBS. Hello, Ursula, and welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's so good to have you. It's so good to that you made this film and given us some insight into this important story. Can you give us a bit of background about how you came about this project? Were you in New York at the time? Did someone approach you? Did you approach the story? Tell us a little bit about this.
I mean, I was in New York at the time, and it was, to put it in context, very much in the center of the emergence of this sort of modern day Black Lives Matter movement. And um, the shooting happened about 4 months after the Eric Garner incident. And I was reading the newspaper like everybody else. And when I read about this incident, which was sort of another in a long list of police abuses, I really, my eyes or my ears or whatever perked up because I saw the last name. And if you've noticed, my last name is the same last name, but it also is a very common Chinese American name. I'm not related to the police officer, but I knew that this was an opportunity to bring the Chinese community into the conversation about police accountability.
Oh, very interesting. So, but your documentary was kind of show both sides, even though you want to bring the Chinese community into it. Can you tell us a little bit about your approach into going into the documentary? How you want to balance out both sides, or didn't you want to balance out both sides? Did it just turn out that way?
Well, I come from a background as a journalist, so I'm always interested in presenting opinions, making sure that people's voices are heard. And I think for me, it was essential that this was a story about two marginalized groups, and that these are both groups that don't have the opportunity to have their voices heard in mainstream media as often as they should be. And so I thought it was important to let them um, have a voice. And so we crafted the film in a very specific way. We didn't do interviews with any of the white subjects in this story. We wanted to elevate the voices of the Chinese American and the Black community in this story. And people have commented that the film seems balanced, but when you actually like break down the footage and look at the minutes of things. Things are not always like an equal one-to-one kind of balance when you're making a film. I mean, part of our editing process was to think about sort of the emotional balance of things, and to even if things don't have equal time, sometimes something that's incredibly emotional and very very short can hold a lot more weight than something that's less emotional and takes a lot longer. So we thought about those things, and when we were testing with audiences, we wanted to know if they felt like the film swung in a particular direction, and we paid attention to that as we went through the footage.
Yeah, I can see your background as a journalist played an important part in developing this film. Can you talk a little more specifically about that when you were doing the interviews and getting the tons of footage and trying to decide? Did you have an idea of how the story was going to unfold, or did you let the story unfold as you talked to more people and shot more footage?
I mean, I think the best filmmakers always keep an open mind. So I think it's really important as you go into interviews and as you go into edits that you're thinking about continuing to think. You're always, you go in with a plan, and you always have to have a plan to make your production costs like keep on track. But when you're in an interview, you want to listen to what somebody's saying, and you want to react to what they're saying, and you want to explore what they're saying a little bit more. And same thing with the edit. I mean, I think an editing process for a documentary can be very long. We probably spent almost, I can't even remember, but so 10 months to a year in actual edit rooms. And as you're sort of piecing and parsing the footage, certain things start elevating. And like I said before, when you're balancing things out, sometimes something, just moving one piece in the edit can change how something else feels. And so we paid a lot of attention to, how we were juxtaposing things and whether we were being fair to what people have said. You do like a 3 hour long interview with somebody, and you end up using a minute or two of what they've said, and you have to make sure that the essence of what you've boiled down is actually fairly representing what they've meant to say.
Yeah, exactly. And I must mention that Ursula has a new baby, so they're part of the interview as well. So we welcome all as well. Um, um, with the interviews, you mentioned maybe you interview someone for 3 hours. Obviously, you can't get all that information into the documentary. Can you tell us some pieces that were actually left out of the documentary that you wish you could have put in if you actually had the time?
I think sometimes it's about whether they fit with the other things that are in the film. I mean, we had to remove entire interviews that we did with people, some folks that we thought were really incredibly interesting, but ultimately audiences may not have understood their story as well, or we just had too much of the same and we just needed to cut for time. So we had a great, an organizer on the Akai Gurley side who lived in East New York, who we spent a lot of time with, and he'll end up being a DVD extra. But he really told some emotional stories about his own personal life, and I really wish we had more time for that in the film. We had, some great footage that we weren't able to license we had to lose, and we even had there was a great panel that happened that I think the Bar Association sponsored that was really much more of a conversation between Black and Asian community organizers, and there were some great things that were said in that panel that including some by a Chinatown historian who's now since passed, and things like that ended up getting cut just for the rhythm of the movie, but will appear on DVD extras, and will always be in my archives of footage. It's sometimes when you're making a film, that it's going to be an hour and a half, but you also realize that this, hundreds of hours of footage that you're collecting are also at some point going to be part of a historical record. So um, I'm glad that I was able to film as much as I was able to film, and in some ways and parts, you'll be able to see that stuff in the future.
Oh, we would look forward to that. Uh, what has the response been to the film? Particularly, were the responses the same between the African American community and the Chinese community?
It's a really hard to answer that question in a time of the pandemic release for a film. So unfortunately, we played in Cleveland and we played digitally there, and so it's hard for me when I don't get to be in a theater with folks and get to talk to them afterwards to know entirely how people are responding. We did have positive reviews in the press, and I've seen tweets and things here and there, and gotten reactions from some of the subjects in the film. I think everybody who watches this comes to the film with a different body of knowledge and life experience. So I think things affect them in different ways. I've had some black audience members say that various things were triggering in the film, even seeing sort of like the all lives matter kind of signs in the protests. And also people say that they really didn't, black audiences say they really didn't see this point of view from the Asian community without having seen it in the film. So being surprised by seeing things like there was one subject in the film that says that they believe that politically, like, Asian Americans are down at the bottom, and I think that was a very surprising for some people to see. And I think that there have been Asian American community members who have told me that um, they felt like the film represented their grievances, and then there are some that are really upset. There is definitely not one point of view in this film. The Asian American community is very divided in how they approached this subject, and there's some folks that are really, in the Asian community, they're very triggered by the very conservative Chinese attitudes in the film. So I think it's been like, it's run the gamut in terms of responses. What does make me excited is that people do have a response, and that they are either disliking things or liking things in the film, and they're talking about them afterwards. And when you're making a film that's not completely an advocacy film from one point of view, you just hope that it's used as a discussion tool in order for advocacy to happen in the future. And so I'm hoping that's what will happen, is that even if people have complicated feelings about the film or things that they don't like about it, I hope that they'll be able to point to what's in the film and use that for further action.
Well, that's a good point. To have a lot of discussion points, and you raised a lot of good points there about reactions amongst the African Americans and the Chinese as well too. Um, this incident happened back in November of 2014, and since then, there's been unarmed black men who have been shot and killed by police, or well, not black men, but just black people in general. The two most notable are George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. Since that happened, and would you have changed anything differently if you had to make this film now, since things have emerged since 2014?
I'm not sure I would change anything about the film, but this film was being released in sort of digital festivals right at the time, the height of those incidents and the protests surrounding them. And it was a very stressful time to be releasing the film. And I almost felt it was a tough film to put out in the space because those incidents were so much more in your face and they were captured on camera. And this is a much more was a much quieter case. So, but I think that it was important that this case happened beforehand because in the case of George Floyd, I saw a lot of the sort of more conservative points of view from the Chinese community move in a different direction in that case. So, a lot of the folks that were in this film supporting Peter Leung through the film were very clearly supporting the George Floyd movement when that came around. And so that was interesting to see. I'm not sure I would have changed anything about the film. It definitely, um, it was an incident. It had its own lifespan, but it takes on new meaning as these things come out. You see different things in the film when you watch it in the context of a Breonna Taylor or a George Floyd conversation. And I do want to mention, because you guys are where you are, that this happened. The incident happened very shortly before Tamir Rice, and so another interesting thing for me to think about. It's not really in the film, but Akai's aunt who protests in the film was also standing in solidarity with a lot of other family members. And there was a case that was very close to the Peter Leung case, and that it happened in a stairwell in a Brooklyn housing project, but it also involved a very young black boy who was holding a toy gun. And so I think about that a lot when I think about the context of your festival and who's watching it in your community.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, that was a very interesting time here in Cleveland. But I guess in that case here in Cleveland, and also in your documentary, we saw that the police officers did not have to serve any jail time at
Right.
all. And one thing that was really interesting was the Eric Gardner case happened shortly before this, and those officers were not charged at all too with this. And I guess the interesting thing is, I think I saw or read somewhere was that there was footage with Eric Gardner, and they weren't charged, and there was no footage other than Peter
Right.
in the hallway, and he was charged with
Right.
that. So can you just talk a little bit about that, and about I guess your feelings on that as a filmmaker?
Well, as a filmmaker, I'm also a human being that has thoughts about these things, and I try not to like push my opinions on other people. And I think one of the things I wanted to do with the film was to allow audiences to have their own journey, because I think when you tell people what to think, they don't necessarily want to absorb that. But when they have their own experience through a film and can come out with a conclusion on their own, I think that their conviction is a lot stronger. And I think we wanted to show that contrast in the film. We did set the film in the context of the Eric Garner case. And I think you're a little bit wrong on one fact, which is I think there was one person that faced consequences in the Eric Garner case, and that was a black female supervisor. And so she did face some consequences that other folks didn't face in that case, which
Okay.
may another, which is, and I only correct you because that's interesting, where the white police officer didn't face the same sort of,
Right.
punishment. Um, and I mean, I think this is one of the arguments that really drove the Asian American community in this case, is that there's so much less evidence. And Eric Garner, there was a white police officer in that case, and they really felt that Peter Liang was a fall guy for the grievances that were not being answered for the black community. So where a white police officer was getting off for in the Eric Garner case, there was, which was very, very close, physically close. It was in Staten Island, and we're in Brooklyn here for this case. It's not very far. That they felt that Peter was taking the weight of the world on his shoulders and not sort of being judged fairly in the context of this case. Um, I think there are a lot of arguments against that, to say that we should just be looking for accountability across the board. We knew that we were making this film, that we would need to make sure that this case set itself in the context of all those other incidents, because when in history, when you look back at things, you don't necessarily see that these are all the surrounding factors. But when you add those surrounding factors, it creates a different kind of light bulb over your head as to what should be happening in this case and why things happened as they did.
Absolutely. You mentioned earlier how you just had people of color that you spoke with in the film. And another thing I noticed that was absent in the film was that you did not have any political figures or pundits or well-known people. And you could have obviously gotten access to lots of news footage for that. And I'll just say a quote, like, for example, Al Sharpton said after the verdict came down about Eric Garner, he says 5 years ago, Eric Garner was choked to death. And today the federal government choked choked Lady Justice. So, I mean, these pundits have like really clever sayings that could have really added to the film, but you left that out. Why did you decide just to have the people speak?
Well, we wanted this to be, the film was about the incident, but it wasn't. It was more about the community's reaction to the incident, and sort of the street level conversations were more interesting to me. I mean, you have pundits saying these things on TV, but there are guys standing on a corner in Brooklyn that are experiencing this stuff every day and don't get to be heard. And I will say, when you asked about like reactions to the film, there are two men at the end of the film wearing white tank tops, and one of them watched the film and recorded a little Instagram live that I watched, which just like said that he was really grateful for his voice to be heard and for his opinion to be out there, because people don't ask him what he thinks about this stuff, but this is his everyday life. And so I felt very proud of the film for offering at least that one person that moment. And so I think, having an ear to these like street corner conversations, these like bubble tea shop conversations is really important, because when you're listening to pundits and stuff, you're not necessarily listening to the whole community. We did include one sort of public figure, and that was the district attorney, Kenneth Thompson, which was a very interesting, he was an interesting subject in the film, and we intended to interview him more, but he actually passed away while we were in the process of filming the film, unexpectedly, which was an incredibly tragic turn to his story. But it's Al Sharpton and folks like Quentin Tarantino were involved in this case. They like spoke out, and we have footage and clips of them. But I think in a lot of these cases, there are a lot of people that are interested in like political and social capital around these cases, and I think that's something else to be critiqued. I believe there was a bit of a conflict with the Al Sharpton camp and the Akai Gurley family. So I remember something, and now it's all a little more fuzzy because it's been so long since we made the film, but sometimes it's really valuable for the family members to have someone speaking out on their behalf, like an Al Sharpton, because they carry a lot of political weight. But and I think people don't realize how much trauma and responsibility family members have to take on when they become a public presence and a public spokesperson for their family. So oftentimes the organizers or the families themselves will like anoint one person. You'll see that Akai's mother is not as involved in our story as the aunt is. And the aunt was the one that shouldered the burden. And that burden includes not being able to mourn and not being able to like fully process your own feelings about this tragedy because you're in the midst of a movement. And so I think that's important for people to remember when they think about these families, is that sometimes they're not, in order to help the greater movement and save more lives and to change these systems, people are making real sacrifices and real emotional sacrifices.
I'm going to put you on the spot, and I'm going to ask you a question, and I'm going to answer the question for you. If you don't like my answer, you can re-answer the question. the question is, who do you side with, whether the African American community or the Asian community? And the answer would be, as a journalist, you like to do your research and let the story unfold. If you get too emotionally involved, it's really hard to tell a good story. But this is personal. This is something you lived with for a long time. So, did I answer the question correctly, or would you like to add more to my answer?
Yeah, you answered it. You gave me a perfect non-answer answer, which is what I would mostly give. I mean, in some ways, I don't want to give my answer because when I want people to ask me how to think about the film when they've left it, I want them to grapple, even if they don't know how to feel after they've answered that they've watched the film. I want them to grapple with that in their own way. I definitely have a point of view in this story, and I have a lot more information than the film presents. I've read every transcript and seen everything, and some of the public narrative is not entirely truthful or accurate. So I'm aware of all those things. I think what I'm most aware of, though, is that this is a conversation that needs to happen between our communities. And the point, I think, there are some folks that dislike the fact that the film makes it feel like there are sides, because there are plenty of Black folks that are in agreement with the people on the Peter Liang side. There's plenty of Asian folks that are in agreement with the Akai Gurley side. And I think one of the things that we tried to allude to in some of the footage that we had and the creative stuff that we did is that solidarity is a conversation we need to have above all else. So, there are things that we disagree upon in this case. There are many things we disagree upon in life, but there are common goals and there are common enemies. And the systems right now are not working for any of us. So I would say that I side with the people that think the systems are not working and that we need to find places of contact where we can fight against these ills, these systems that are not working, even if we're on different sides of an equation, that we are still fighting the same enemy. And so that's the sort of the side that I like to take, coming out of this story.
Okay, well, thank you for that response and for letting me put you on the spot there. Um, I want to know what you have learned from this project. I know I did some in preparing for this interview. I knew you grew up in like Newton, Massachusetts. It wasn't diverse at all, and here you are making a film that's about diversity. So, what have you learned from this? And is this to counter your upbringing, or was it just something you just wanted to explore because it really touched you?
I mean, I think that a lot of the films I make are related to how I grew up. And I did grow up in an undiverse, mostly white dominant neighborhood. And I grew up as a mixed race person. So I think that really has a big effect on the stories I want to tell, because I'm interested in sort of building bridges and looking at other people's perspectives. I also, made a very conscious effort to make the film team reflect the subject matter. And so our film team was largely people of color, very woman dominant. It was Black and Asian. And we wanted to sort of walk the walk, and sort of work together on making this project. And so I think my we had two editors, one was Asian and one was Black. And um, spending many, many hours in an editing room with each of them, I think was very instructive. We looked at footage differently. We looked at stories differently, and we had those conversations in the edit. And so I think I learned a lot from listening to my collaborators. And I guess I would just encourage people to do that in general, just to, you don't need to absorb anything that people say, but to listen to, you know, folks from different points of view, I think is very valuable, and you can learn a lot from that. And I think that's what the film offers too. You're going to disagree with a ton of stuff that's in the film, but if you've at least listened to it, you can strengthen your own argument. Um, you work for years on a film, you learn a lot, and down from like how to direct animation or music, to just like looking at the same graphic in a transcript and thinking and looking at the ricochet, and thinking, oh, this is a really, one in a million shot that this would ricochet off this way and go this way, to looking at it and saying, actually, no, that actually, where it ricocheted is actually at a point that's not far off of a body level, or it's all the things. But yeah, I would say I learned the most from working with my editors and my collaborators, and listening to them.
Absolutely. We don't have too much time left. Let's talk more specifically about the future of this film. Oh, one question I did want to ask is the title. Why did you give this film this title? And also, did you have a working title throughout this film?
No, we actually started with this one, and we're trying to come up with better ones. You know, number one, it's a little descriptive. It'll remind you that it's a story about a stairwell, but we wanted something that was a little bit neutral, you know, that didn't point one way or the other. And I think it's also like, you know, it alludes to sort of the danger of us not having these conversations that I'm talking about. You know, if we, you know, there's a little like walking down a stairwell when you're talking about the incident and Akai and Peter going down the stairwell, but it's also like, where are we headed, in what direction, and what abyss are we walking into if we don't start having conversations about these types of complicated issues?
Okay, well, very good. With the film, what's next for the film? I know it it aired on PBS. Do you plan to put it
Yes.
in more festivals? Do you plan to put it on streaming services? What's next for the film?
We now have a distributor on board, Kino Lorber, so you can find out more information at the Kino Lorber website. I believe that there are already pre-sales for DVDs and educational, and actually we got a really interesting grant from the city in New York, and there are ads that are going up on the subways and in bus shelters in New York City right now, which is kind of exciting for the film and the life of the film. So, you know, I hope it'll have like a really robust life in the educational space, and we're working on an impact campaign. So I'm using the film to very directly have more conversations about these issues and police accountability and solidarity building. So we kind of paused a little bit on our impact campaign because we wanted to have more moments to be in person with each other. So that will be sort of rolling out. And if there are folks that are interested in getting involved or bringing the film to their campuses, they can definitely reach us at noncompliantfilms.com or check out the Kino Lorber website.
Wonderful. I imagine there's some supplemental materials, educational materials associated with this.
Yeah, absolutely. PBS actually built a whole discussion guide to go along with the film, which is interesting. It pairs some historical context and some shorter clips that I believe, I'm not sure if it's posted free online now, but it will be at some point in time. And we also have additional materials like on the DVD, so including a behind the scenes clip. I don't know if you noticed or listened to the credit roll, but the credit roll is an original song that was written by Akai's friend Giz. So Giz appears in the film. He's with a dog, and he wrote a song in collaboration with a Chinese American producer, and they recorded it original for this. And so the behind the scenes of that recording is on the DVD.
Wonderful. What's next for you?
For
Do you have a
me,
project that you're working on now?
actually, just announced yesterday, I'm a Firelight and Frontline fellow. So I'm going to be creating a short film, investigative film for Frontline that will be probably airing next summer or next fall. So I am soliciting tips for any kind of investigative ideas. If people want to reach out to me, you can find me on all the socials at you know, just Google my name. It's pretty easy to find. And I'll be developing that over the next 3 months and then in production early next year.
Oh, wonderful. We look forward to that with your persistence. I'm sure we're in for a real treat with that. Before I let you go, as you know, this conversation is part of the Anna Fields Wolf Book Awards. And I was just wondering, was there a particular book in your life that may have inspired you or, you know, help you become the person that you are or that you really enjoyed in the past?
I love this question because there's a few books that I've read over and over again, and so it's easy to answer. One is Balzac and the Little Chinese Seamstress. That's a great book, and sort of celebrates the joy of the arts. It's a story set in China, and then I had, you know, I grew up in a very undiverse time in undiverse town, but I did have my English teacher in either, I think, I can't remember what grade, but maybe third grade, was a Black woman who introduced me to Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. And I was very affected by that book as a very young person. So I think it sparked my interest in the Black community. It sparked my interest in a different language and in ways of telling stories. And that's another book that I've reread over and over again. And it's a classic that most people should have read already. But if you haven't, that's one to put on your shelf.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you very much for spending some time with us and giving us some insight into this great piece of work. We wish you all the best. And we'd like to thank our audience as well for joining us for this important conversation. For more information about Sif Streams and Anna Fields Wolf Book Awards program, please visit clevelandfilm.org or annisfield-wolf.org. I'm Eric Seiler. Thank you.